Pearl Harbor is one of those cases where something happens that directs the attention of the American public to foreign policy in a way that they can't avoid thinking about it. Right? You have to admit that's a pretty spectacular and rather urgent way of forcing people to think about foreign policy, as the Iranian hostage crisis was. And in the same way, so for the first time, Americans are now paying attention to foreign policy, and they say, wow, there are such crazy people in the world. Here we are, just minding our own business. You know, we were on a picnic when the thing happened. And here these crazy people want to attack us. Well, go figure human nature. Americans are the most peaceful, sweetest, most generous people in the world, people who love their children, right? Basically good guys. And here these awful people now attacking us. Well, as you know, in the case of the Iranian hostage crisis, there was a whole history that the American people were unaware of. For 25 years, the Americans had supported, in every way, a government which they had imposed on the Iranians, the government of the Shah. After in the 1950s, the American CIA overthrew the nationalist government of Mossadegh in Iran. Supported then the Shah's government, made him our ally in that area, set up the Shah's secret police, the Savak, with the CIA expertise, and for some reason there were groups in Iran which held this against us. And when they could humiliate us, when they could seize our embassy, when they could permit pictures to be taken of the American flag being used to transport trash out to the garbage pail, they did it to get back. The Japanese attack us on December 7th, 1941, not because they are totally insane, not because they had nothing better to do that day. They attack us because of what had happened in the months preceding. The Japanese, whatever you might want to say about them, and during the Second World War there was almost everything said about them. There are not too many people who are old enough to realize the degree of race hatred that was institutionalized and permitted against the Japanese in that war, much worse than against the Germans. The Japanese, whatever you want to say about them, are not really stupid. They don't willingly take on a country as powerful as the United States. In 1941, when the United States enters the war, American GNP is equal to that of Britain, Germany, Russia, and Japan put together. Japan produces 15% of the U.S. GNP in 1941, and the Japanese really are not stupid. Why did they do this? They felt that the alternative was too humiliating. Too humiliating. American policy was that the Japanese, in expanding into China, and then further down into Southeast Asia, trying to take over Indochina from the weak French Vichy government, East Asian empire of theirs was going to cut America off from too much of the world market, and besides, they were being very bad people. With Cordell Hull, again, and with Stimson and Roosevelt, you have, again, that Woodrow Wilson type hectoring, nagging, nudging type of approach to foreign policy. Okay? You're very bad people. You do bad things. What do you mean, being aggressive and trying to create a world empire at this time in history? Japanese say, well, we came too late, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. The British, French, and others have their empires. The Americans say it's not permissible, not permissible. And the situation gets worse and worse. After the Tripartite Pact, because the United States is very suspicious of Japan, and then as 1941 goes on. The immediate cause of the attack on Pearl Harbor was the freezing of Japanese assets and the subsequent petroleum embargo against Japan in the summer of 1941. As a last-ditch appeal, the Japanese say, let's get together, send Prince Konoye, the Japanese Prime Minister, anywhere you want, Hawaii, San Francisco, even on American soil, to discuss these issues. The Americans say, well, that sounds interesting. First of all, you have to get out of China. The Japanese say, this is unheard of. The idea that the issue to be discussed will be settled beforehand. And what country, I mean, I'm not saying that the Japanese were justified in China, by no means. By no means. And they were particularly brutal in an awful kind of way in China. But what other empire in history has ever voluntarily withdrawn from hundreds of thousands of square miles and control over tens and hundreds of millions of people? No country's ever done that. We could just as easily have demanded that the English get out of India, or else we would attack England. It's simply not the way things are done among great powers. But this American moralistic tone prevailed. The Japanese are getting more and more desperate. The oil embargo, of course, means that a time bomb is ticking away. The reserves of the Japanese Imperial Navy are being depleted day by day. The oil embargo is also one on the part of Britain and the Netherlands against Japan. You understand, other countries don't think that the world was made so that the United States lays down the law whenever it wants. The Japanese are not going to permit their Navy to be stranded, to be grounded without petroleum. Before the reserves are exhausted, they will make a move. Okay, and they do at Pearl Harbor. Those battleships at Pearl Harbor, Battleship Row, again, great foresight on the part of a government agency. Right? You know that the battleships were lined up one after the other. It looks nice. It suggests great power. It sure does. Those ships go into history along with the other great mystery ships. The USS Maine, mysteriously blown up in Havana Harbor, edging the United States, giving a big push to the war against Spain. Or the ships in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. The destroyers, allegedly fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, providing the reason for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was a legal base, such as it was, for the Vietnamese War. Other ships, the Lusitania, not an American ship, but playing a role in American history. It's carrying 6 million rounds of ammunition, at least. What was it doing in submarine-infested waters out in the open that way? A target for German submarines. The USS Liberty, the American spy ship, destroyed by the Israelis in 1967. What was the real story there? Well, those ships in Pearl Harbor are another of the phantom, you might say the phantom ships or the mystery ships. The reason it's a mystery only came out after the war. President Roosevelt, of course, in his inimitable way, goes to Congress and says, we were totally surprised by this dastardly attack. There was a revisionist historian named Charles Tansel, who used to tell his classes at Georgetown, President Roosevelt went to Yalta and came back and told the American people he had made no concessions to Stalin. So the dying Roosevelt finished as he had lived, with a lie on his lips. This is a man for whom deception was a way of life. This Roosevelt. Well, to give you an example, from the author I mentioned before, Dalek, talking about Roosevelt's policy in staging incidents in the North Atlantic and so on. In the light of the national unwillingness to face up fully to the international dangers confronting the country, you see, this is an apologist for Roosevelt. In the light of the fact that the American people were not willing to face up to our dangers, it is difficult to fault Roosevelt for building a consensus by devious means. Okay, in other words, by lying about it. He told the people that we had been totally surprised at Pearl Harbor. That wasn't true. And the main reason it wasn't true is that we had broken the Japanese diplomatic code, and we were privy to the messages sent from Tokyo to the consulate in Honolulu, to the Japanese embassy in Washington, to the Japanese consulate in Hong Kong, and so on. We intercepted their messages, and we could translate them and read them. You might ask yourself, what more do you have to be aware of an impending attack of that magnitude? Do you have to be there right in the room where they're talking about it? Do you have to actually be there? The whole issue of Pearl Harbor is still one which is very murky, very obscure, and books keep coming out all the time. A couple of years ago, 2 books came out, one on either side. The pro-Roosevelt one was Pranga. Pro-Roosevelt in the sense that the story is given out by the administration that they were totally surprised by the attack. This story is maintained. The opposite, that the Roosevelt administration had culpable knowledge of the impending attack, is presented by the popular historian John Toland in a book called Infamy. There were a number of investigations, and I think it is still impossible to say exactly what happened. What we do know is that the messages that were deciphered and translated and known to the administration become increasingly that the Japanese messages to the embassy in Washington become increasingly frantic. As November goes on, we know that on November 25th, Secretary of War Stimson, by the way, the man who had been Secretary of State under Hoover is now brought into the administration as Secretary of War. And as Tansel said, nobody ever deserved the name more. Stimson, by the way, is a Republican. This is the beginning of the bipartisan foreign policy. Whatever American foreign policy is supported by all good Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. It's another part of Roosevelt's very clever politicking in this. November 25th, Stimson wrote in his diary about a meeting at the White House. There the president brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked. This is November 25th. Perhaps as soon as next Monday. For the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Just to give you an idea, on December 1st, messages are intercepted to various diplomatic outposts from Tokyo, ordering them to begin burning documents and code books. On the night of December 6th, Saturday night, this is all in the record of the Pearl Harbor investigations, a message is received, intercepted to the Japanese embassy in Washington, saying, from Tokyo, we are starting to send you a 13-part message. Okay, wait until you have the whole thing, then deliver it to the State Department exactly at 1 p.m. tomorrow, Sunday. Okay, a messenger comes over from the decoding agency right to the White House. President Roosevelt is there with his friend Harry Hopkins, and looks over the message and turns to Hopkins and says, according to the naval officer who is the messenger, "This means war." Well, this means war, and what do the leaders of the American government do that night, knowing that war is going to come the next day? President Roosevelt plays with his stamp collection. The head of naval operations, Admiral Stark, goes to the theater. The head of the Army, George Marshall, doesn't know what he did that night. And it's the same all across the board. Well, you see, this is the sort of thing that keeps suspicions about Pearl Harbor alive. So this is very, very strange stuff. The next morning, people are going to their offices. George Marshall goes, the head of the Army, goes horseback riding, by the way. Doesn't get into his office until about 11:30. For weeks, they have suspected that war might break out any day. Doesn't get to his office until 11:30. It occurs to him, just as it occurs to somebody over the Navy Department, except the Navy Department, they say, we're not going to do anything about this. That doesn't really matter. It's a coincidence. It occurs to him that 1 o'clock Washington time is dawn in Hawaii. And he's going to send a message to General Short, who's the head of the Army in the Hawaiian Islands. Instead of using the scrambler telephone on his desk, he sends the message by commercial telegraph, by Western Union. The message is received while Pearl Harbor is burning. Now, was Roosevelt somehow planning to use Pearl Harbor as a way to get us into the war? I don't think there's any way of answering that definitively. But that Roosevelt, by that time, very much wanted to get us into the war, there is no doubt anymore. That old argument, was Roosevelt sincere when he said, I'm in favor of peace, we have to stay out of this war, there's no one who wants peace more than I do. That argument is finished. Roosevelt lied about that, and he deceived the American people. The British documents were released. One relevant document, one relevant set of documents released on January 1st, 1972, and I'm quoting from the New York Times account. War entry plans laid to Roosevelt. Britain releases her data on talks with Churchill. Formerly top-secret British government papers made public today said that President Franklin D. Roosevelt told Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August 1941 that he was looking for an incident to justify opening hostilities against Nazi Germany. On August 19th, Churchill reported to the War Cabinet in London on other aspects of the Atlantic Charter meeting that were not made public. Quote, he, Roosevelt, was obviously determined that they should come in. If he were to put the issue of peace and war to Congress, they would debate it for months. The President had said he would wage war but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative. If the Germans did not like it, they could attack American forces. Everything was to be done to force an incident. End quote, from the minutes of the British cabinet. So, well, when people say, oh, they're just a bunch of old Roosevelt haters, there's a very special reason why this man is particularly hated in American history, and it comes with the sort of unforgiving hatred that you feel for somebody who has used you and lied to you and violated you, who has had you do things according to his will, against your own will, by manipulating and deceiving you. And that's what he did in connection with the Second World War. Time is getting very short. We're not going to be able to get into the epic of this war in as much detail as I had thought. It is a great war. It is, as we are told again and again, the last good war. Good not necessarily in terms of its consequences, which have brought about the destruction of any possibility of a balance of power in Europe and East Asia by the total destruction of Japanese military forces. According to the Constitution we forced on the Japanese, they are not permitted to have armed forces. Okay, very typical of the mentality of the time. The idea that somehow circumstances never change. Time can be frozen. The idea that perhaps the Japanese might sometime require armed forces did not occur to the American policymakers. The West Germany that exists today is 1/2 the size of Bismarck's Reich, because of the division with East Germany, and also because all of these territories were taken away from Germany after the Second World War. Poland was moved west. That was one of the things that was done at Yalta. They decided to move Poland west. They did that by giving this territory to Russia, and the Poles took over East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland, and Silesia, Silesia here. Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia. The Czechs finally solved the German question that had come up, that had been created with Czechoslovakia in 1919. They simply expelled 3.5 million Germans. This is an aspect of the Second World War, by the way, which is not much discussed, and that is the expulsion of 17 million Germans from totally German areas in 1944 and 1945. That was one of the episodes at the end of the war. Something like 2.5 million Germans still unaccounted for. Clearly enough, many of them died in the course of the expulsion. Well, the last good war. The main problem with this idea of the last good war is that one of our allies was Joseph Stalin. And I wonder how long people can keep compartmentalized in their minds. On the one hand, last good war, great heroic alliance with Britain and Russia. On the other hand, another compartment of their minds, what we have learned from people like Solzhenitsyn in his book on the Gulag Archipelago. Okay? What was the nature of this regime with which we allied ourselves and which we supported? And by the way, here's another insight on Roosevelt, also from Dalek's book. Roosevelt, after Russia is attacked by Germany in June of 1941, has to convince the American people that we should send Lend-Lease to Russia. Okay, there's a good deal of anti-communism in those days, especially among American Catholics. So, according to Dalek, he told a press conference on September 30th that Article 124 of the Russian Constitution guaranteed freedom of conscience. Freedom equally to use propaganda against religion, he said, which is essentially what is the rule in this country, only we don't quite put it the same way. Roosevelt, like Wilson, was not a very not a man with great intellectual scope. What he was trying to do, in some unbelievably dumb way, was convince the Americans that there was freedom of religion in Russia. Therefore, it was okay to send them Lend-Lease. And he actually said that this article of the Stalinist Constitution, which guaranteed freedom of religion, was pretty much the same as the American First Amendment. That's maybe the nadir of misunderstanding. What was the nature of this regime of Stalin's? It was a dictatorship from the moment that an authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorship from the moment that the Bolsheviks had taken over in 1917. The history of the Soviet secret police is so notorious that every few years they have to change their name, change their initials from Cheka to GPU to AGPU to NKVD to MVD and to today the KGB. Robert Conquest, the British historian, has a book called The Great Terror, and you can read this, of course, in Solzhenitsyn also, the Gulag Archipelago. What was the character of this regime? This was a regime which, in the period of the collectivization of agriculture after 1928, caused, through the famines that came about and through actual warfare waged on the peasantry, which refused to give up the land, caused an unknown number of deaths, probably in the range of 4 to 6 million. There came the purge of the Communist Party itself in the middle of the 1930s, the great show trials and the purge of the party, in which, according to Conquest, there were 7 million arrests, and 1 out of every 10 people arrested was shot. Now, no libertarian has anything but the deepest disgust for the regime of filth and total denigration and destruction of the human personality set up by Hitler and his Nazis. However, the analogous German purge, known as the Night of the Long Knives, which occurs in June of 1934, costs about 200 lives. And what's happening behind the Iron Curtain in Russia, nobody knows about. The greatest number of lives, of course, were lost in connection with the Gulag itself, the system of slave labor camps that Solzhenitsyn compares to islands, an archipelago, strung out along the Great Sea of the Soviet Union. These concentration camps took all comers, masses and masses of people in successive waves. At first, of course, Tsarists and Mensheviks, Russian anarchists were sent to these labor camps, Orthodox priests, then the kulaks, the Ukrainian peasantry and the peasantry in other parts of the Soviet Union, then the members of the Communist Party itself when it was being purged. Then, when Russia starts expanding in Eastern Europe, Polish prisoners of war, many of whom were murdered at Katyn Forest. Then, when it takes over the Baltic states, the Lithuanian and Estonian and Latvian middle classes transported en masse into the camp system. Then, German prisoners of war, Japanese, Hungarians, whoever is fighting on the Russian front. At times, when they need labor in the camps to build the Baltic White Sea Canal, they will go into movie theaters in Moscow, put on the lights, arrest everyone there, put them into trucks, and send them to the camps. This is a system of camps all across the Soviet Union. Vorkuta is up here, out on the Pacific in Siberia, across from Japan. There is the notorious, you might as well know the name, Kolyma. It is a system of camps in itself, covering an area 4 times the size of France, in which, according to Conquest, probably around 3 million people died. This is the nature of our ally. And I ask you to imagine, as a hypothetical, imagine a photograph taken in the course of the Second World War. And what it shows is 3 allies and friends partying wherever. Some international meeting, heads of states, and they're partying, toasting each other. You have Franklin Roosevelt, and you have Winston Churchill, and you have Adolf Hitler. Does that sound repulsive? Well, you had exactly that photograph, except it wasn't Hitler, it was Stalin. Winston Churchill, in his endless hypocrisy, goes so far at Tehran as to give Stalin a crusader's sword. A sword which had been in the possession of the British Crown. It seems to me it's a very big thing to come to a conclusion about, but this puts into doubt, this at least raises the question of the moral character of this war. The war, of course, is even further compromised by the way it is conducted. In the 19th century, the classical liberals and the atmosphere of classical liberalism led to an attempt to define rules of warfare, to put limits even on the violence of warfare. In the course of the Second World War, this is given up. The only place it's not really is in the African War, which is one reason that becomes a kind of favorite war of a lot of people in North Africa, because it's more of a gentlemanly war. It's more of a war where the rules are respected. There are no rules respected on the Eastern Front, on either side. As soon as the war breaks out in the Pacific, there are no rules of warfare respected. Very few prisoners taken. Any ship is sunk on sight. And you know something of the German destruction of civilians in Europe, especially of European Jewry. But all of the states committed acts of great horror. Not only the German state, not only the Russian state, the British state, which says to itself, we cannot afford the losses of our troops that we suffered in the First World War. We don't have the men anymore. We will reduce Germany to surrender through incessant terror bombing of its cities. And about 700,000 German civilians are killed from the air. The deliberate target of British policy. That is, it was a policy of killing civilians in order to terrorize the Germans and to break their will. The classic examples of the destruction of Hamburg in 1943, when it was discovered that certain combination of certain weather conditions and the intense bombardment created something new called a firestorm. And then in February of 1945, when Germany was already defeated, the destruction of Dresden. It was the first human city that was taken out. Dresden had not been bombed in the whole course of the war because there was nothing in Dresden. There's a good book by an uneven historian named David Irving, called The Destruction of Dresden. This is, I think, one of his better books. Probably around 135,000 people were killed. It was, you understand, 4 nights and 3 days of bombing. And when the neutral countries of Europe woke up the next day, I'm talking about in Zurich, in Stockholm, Madrid, Americans had never heard of Dresden. Why should they have? But it's as if we woke up one day and we found out that a particularly beautiful American city, let's say like San Francisco or Boston, had ceased to exist. There was a thrill of horror that went through Europe. The war is capped by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A now classic book on the subject is by the historian Martin Sherwin, also in paperback, A World Destroyed. Okay, and the reasons for the bombing and the reasons why the bombings were not really necessary. You know, it's an endless argument one way or the other, but it's clear, I think, enough that the Japanese would have surrendered, not unconditionally as had been demanded. They wanted certain conditions. One condition is that they didn't want the emperor to be put on trial as a war criminal and hanged in front of his palace. Before that would happen, yes, the Japanese race would commit suicide. But that they were open to negotiations and certain conditions is clear. By the way, it's now that the Americans are beginning to go a little wacky with their air power. A little wacky. You know that after the bombing of Hiroshima, the Japanese are given 2 days. So it takes time to bring a war machine to a halt. And then Nagasaki is destroyed. I don't want to be too pathetic about it, but but Nagasaki is in opera the home of Cho-Cho-san, in Madame Butterfly, and that's where she waits for her American officer to appear from over the horizon. And then Truman said, enough. Okay, you know, leave it. Let's at least give that crusty, beloved old Truman that much enough. He had, of course, destroyed 2 Japanese cities rather than negotiate. The American Air Force general in the Pacific on the spot at Tinian, Curtis LeMay, wanted to use a 3rd bomb. Can anyone guess what city he wanted to have as the target for the 3rd atomic bomb? Tokyo. Right. I'm saying there's something happening now with the American military, which I'm not a communist. Okay, I've never been a communist. Closest I ever came to being a communist, I was a Republican. But our leaders and our military leaders are really to be judged on the same basis as others. This has come out in Fred Kaplan's new book, The Wizards of Armageddon. I think, according to the notes, he must have gotten it from Robert McNamara himself. When McNamara becomes Secretary of Defense in 1961, under the Kennedy administration, naturally he says, okay, let me show me all the plans you have. The SAC, that's Strategic Air Command General, Tom Power, the head of SAC, shows him the contingency plans in the event of war with Russia and China. China is still an ally of Russia at this time. McNamara is aghast. They call for the death in the first few days of 285 million Russians and Chinese through massive, indiscriminate nuclear bombing of Eurasia, and they call for the obliteration of Albania. There happens to be a radar defense installation there. And the SAC general says to McNamara, and this really annoys McNamara with a sort of smirk, I hope you don't have any friends or relations in Albania because we're going to have to wipe it out. I tell you this in all honesty. Something like those contingency plans would have not necessarily deterred, but they would have embarrassed Hitler and Himmler. Well, there's many other things we could talk about. Let me just say this. Why do we have this emphasis, or at least in these few lectures, on war and America's wars in the 20th century? Because, the reason is this, because the fact of the matter is nothing has increased the power of the American state through its history, and especially in the 20th century, as warfare. Okay, let me quote from a very good book.